Good evening, everyone. Good evening. On behalf of the Harris School of Public Policy, I would like to give you all a very warm welcome and thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Michelle Horath, and I am the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion here at Harris. We are honored to partner with the Organization of Black Students, also known as OBS, on the Kent Lecture for the third year in a row now. And for all of us to experience tonight's speaker here in person, it really is going to be a special treat, so thank you. OBS has hosted the Kent Lecture since 1984, and the lecture series has featured leading Black scholars, writers, and activists in honor of one of the first Black professors to earn tenure here at the university. Tonight's conversation will be facilitated by some of our amazing OBS students. And throughout the conversation, please feel free to use the QR code to start submitting your questions. We will start with that platform first, but for those who are not able to use the QR code, we will absolutely make sure that we have a mic available for you as well. We will start tonight off with Jordan Varese, who is a second-year student in the college, and she's also from the state of Ohio. She's studying political science and sociology. She currently serves as the political chair for OBS. And outside of OBS and outside of her coursework, she is involved in the Service Committee for Women in Law, Leaders of Color cohort member, Black Professional Society cohort member, and the Georgiana Rose organization. So once again, thank you all for spending your evening with us. You are absolutely going to enjoy this live and in-person speaker. And so with that, I will pass the mic over to Jordan.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining OBS tonight, whether in person or virtually, for our annual Dr. George E. Kent Lecture. The purpose of the Organization of Black Students at the University of Chicago is to provide an organizational framework to address issues of concern to the Black community on campus and at large. OBS serves as support, protection, and as a catalyst to Black students and their development. We endeavor to build a better understanding of the Black experience that through its members, programs, resources, and functions permeates the university atmosphere and develops community solidarity. One of the ways in which we achieve this is through our annual Dr. George E. Kent Lecture. In continuing this tradition, OBS is enthused to introduce Ms. Ilyasah Shabazz as our 2022 keynote speaker. Professor Ilyasah Shabazz is an award-winning author, educator, and producer. She has authored 5 historical novels and has served as project advisor for the PBS award-winning film, Prince Among Slaves. She is co-chairperson of the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center. In her work to preserve the legacy of her parents, she has dedicated herself to institution building and intergenerational leadership development with the tenets of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ms. Shabazz has furthered her community impact with the City University of New York's Office of Academic Affairs, where she created a curriculum to encourage higher education for underserved inner-city high school dropouts. She has worked with the Office of the Mayor in Mount Vernon as Director of Public Affairs and Special Events, and she founded and produced a young adult development program. The purpose of the program was to provide insight on social justice, encouraging personal empowerment. As president and founder of Ilyasah Shabazz Enterprises, she produces a variety of forums dedicated to power, possibility, and sovereignty. Ms. Shabazz holds a Master of Science in Education and Human Resource Development from Fordham University and a Bachelor of Science in Biology from New Paltz College. Currently, she is an adjunct professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City, where she teaches perspectives on justice in the Africana world. Grounded in the commitments of her parents, Ms. Shabazz emphasizes empowerment and inclusion in her teaching and scholarship. With all of that being said, please join me in giving a round of applause and extending a warm welcome to our 2022 keynote speaker, Ms. Ilyasah Shabazz.
Thank you very, very much. I was just taken by surprise when my cousin and my other cousin came walking in here. So thank you, Grace Little Henton, for coming. And of course, to my younger cousin, every time I post photographs, they, but thank you, sweetheart, Dara. And to my beautiful girlfriend there, Pamela Johnson. Pamela Shine. It's such an honor for me to be here with you this evening as one of 6 daughters of Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz. To the student organizers, Organization of Black Students, Kent Lecture Series, in partnership with the Harris School of Public Policy, thank you for your legacy, your steadfast work and dedication, making it possible for all of us to gather in fellowship this evening. And thank you for inviting me here to discuss Malcolm X Shabazz, why the legacy we leave matters. In the 1950s, it was Dr. Carter G. Woodson who said the biggest race is to see who will control the minds of young people. And so young people, you must recognize your power. To the seniors, I encourage you to mentor the incoming freshmen. Make sure they know, as my father said, that stumbling is not falling. Help them avoid the pitfalls of individualism, materialism, and consumerism. Teach them to embrace the values of literature, education, and responsibility, and let them know it will be their responsibility to do the same when they become seniors, to reach back to the freshmen. A culture of excellence demands effort, sustained effort. Sometimes we take these things for granted. It is created when we do more than aspire to make a name for ourselves, but instead when we strive to leave a legacy for others. And so I ask you, what legacy do you hope to leave? First and foremost, I'd like to give praise to the Almighty, our Creator. I'd also like to give praise to our ancestors, all of them, and on this occasion, particularly the refined, industrious men and women of African ancestry, Black, Indigenous, people of color, those who have not been properly honored in history, those whose stories have been improperly documented. We give praise to the countless men and women who birthed humanity, who birthed thriving civilizations, including those who migrated across the earth, birthing new civilizations. Our descendants who endured physical and psychological trauma, and the largest forced migration of a people in the history of humankind. However, we still stand and we prosper. We are strong, we are vigilant, and we are interconnected as a human family. On February 21st, 1965, my mother, sisters, and I witnessed the assassination of her husband, our young father, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz Malcolm X. My pregnant mother placed her body over my 3 sisters and me to protect us from gunfire and to make sure we would not see the terror before us. In spite of witnessing the horrific assassination of her young husband, Sister Betty never gave in to bitterness or despair. Even though she had every right, she never accepted no or I can't as an answer for herself. She kept my father's essence, his love, values, humanity, and morale, integral in our household. She wanted to make sure that her 6 daughters did not suffer from the immediate loss of our father, that we did not suffer from the abrupt loss of his love and presence. And though he was physically gone, my mother made certain that her husband remained a part of our household conversations for as long as I can remember. I knew my father loved me. I knew he had impeccable integrity and a great sense of humor, coming from a large family. I knew he loved music, literature, poetry, history, nature, and the arts. He was a brilliant man, compassionate and loving, and I knew that overall, he was led by his service to God. We had beautiful butterfly and poetry collections that were his. We had his clothes, his briefcase, and his size 14 shoes that we would put our feet in and try to romp around in them. And we had an abundance of stories, love notes, and smiling photos of him everywhere. It was only in college that I began to learn about the inaccurate portrayals of his character and life's work. I started to understand why my mother protected us from the negative depictions of her husband so that his legacy and work could be accurately realized for the benefit of future generations. My father burst onto the scene of the civil rights movement as a young man just in his 20s, not older than many of you here. The climate in America was antithetical to the humanity of African Americans, not all that different from today's climate. Jim Crow and Jane Crow, and separate but unequal were the law of the land. The rights of African Americans were denied under color of law. Black people were terrorized by individuals and organizations which had no fear of repercussion. They lived without protection and without hope for a just America. In humble submission to God, Malcolm X stood up and stepped forward. You see, Malcolm didn't emerge in a vacuum. He didn't go to prison, illiterate, and miraculously walk out as the Malcolm X. Malcolm studied Islam from a Pakistani musician before he met Elijah Muhammad. He was a star debater on the prison's team. They debated Ivy League schools. Malcolm studied the dictionary, not because he couldn't read or write, but because he was fascinated by etymology. He labored to become his best self, and that's what he became. Here's a beautiful poem he wrote at the age of 21 for musicians, and this was something that we discovered when I released my latest book, The Awakening of Malcolm X. And I quote, we found this in one of his friends' file. That Black musician, he picks up his horn and starts blowing sounds he's never thought of before. He improvises, he creates it. It comes from within. It's his soul. It's that soul music. It's the only area on the American scene where the Black man has been free to create, and he's mastered it. He's shown that he can come up with something no one has ever created before. Likewise, he can do the same thing given intellectual independence. He can come up with a new philosophy. He can invent a new society, a social system that is different from anything that exists or has ever existed. And this was about in the 1940s. And so when his favorite teacher asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, as he was already top of his class and class president, he said he wanted to be a lawyer, not a musician or a firefighter or a doctor, but a lawyer, because it's what he saw in his father. But his teacher told him in no uncertain terms it wasn't a realistic goal for the N-word. And so when students are at a crossroads, they need adults around them to guide, nurture, and protect their way back home. When we tell students what they can't do, we create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Social psychologist Claude Steele, who received an honorary doctorate from right here, University of Chicago, calls this the stereotype threat. If a woman is about to take a math test, she will perform worse if she's told that women aren't expected to do well in math. When Black students are told they will underperform in college, their academic performance winds up being suppressed. But the reverse holds true as well. When we lift each other up, we are empowered to reach our true potential. And Steele's book, which I encourage you to read, is entitled Whistling Vivaldi. The title comes from Claude Steele's friendship with Brent Staples. You may know of him from his work for the New York Times, but he received his PhD again right here at the University of Chicago. So the story of Whistling Vivaldi goes something like this. It was around 2010. Dr. Brent Staples was a graduate student at the time here in Hyde Park. He soon learned that at a PWI, do you know what a PWI is? Simply walking down Woodlawn Avenue or over by the Medici on East 57th Street can be enough to make white people feel uncomfortable. As a clinical psychologist, he realized that the reactions he experienced here in Hyde Park reflected a negative And so one day, as he was walking in Hyde Park, a security guard, or some George Zimmerman-style self-appointed security guard, began to follow him around. And it was only after he began to whistle the music of the Italian composer Antonio Vivaldi that the person decided, oh, he might be safe. He might be a person of refinement. And for this reason, Steele titled his book, Whistling Vivaldi. I thought that would be interesting because it all happened so close to your campus. And he was a U Chicago graduate alum. But you better believe that Malcolm X encountered the stereotype threat more than a time or two in his young life, whether in Hyde Park or Central Park. Yet, he was ready for the moment. At your age, he was preparing, intellectually and morally, to be an advocate for his sisters and brothers. His appreciation for this historic moment should come as no surprise. Blessed with an incredible intellect and profound compassion, Malcolm was ideally situated to become a leader. But still, most observers do not know that Malcolm's capacity for activism, because the story that has been written of Malcolm is so far from the truth. That this activism was nurtured by his parents, Reverend Earl and Louise Little. They believed in their son, Malcolm Little, and they prepared him for the role he eventually assumed. Now, I don't want to say that my cousin Grace Little Hinton here's father was a relative of my father, but thank you for coming. She's one of the first ladies of their church here in Chicago. So it seems that this spirituality runs deep. But the Littles were members of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. It was founded in 1914 by Marcus Garvey. The organization commanded millions of followers worldwide. And this organization was dedicated to providing racial pride, economic self-sufficiency, and the formation of an independent nation during the height of Jim Crow. It was just 45 years after Emancipation Proclamation. And so Malcolm's father, Earl Little, was a young Baptist minister. He was a husband and a father. And he purchased land that was reserved for whites only. Reverend Earl Little was also president of the Industrial League, chapter president of the Garvey movement, and a member of the Parent Teacher Association. He was about 6'4". He had farming land, a fancy car, and with all of these attributes, he was targeted by the KKK and ultimately lynched. Malcolm's mother was an educated woman who spoke several languages and the recording secretary for the Garvey movement. 7 years after her husband was murdered without any protection, she was committed to an institution against her will. And it's something that they did to many women back during these days. If a husband wanted to divorce his wife, he'd put her in an institution. However, she reached out to 3 other West Indian families who were also members of the Garvey movement and made them promise if the local authorities came to take her anywhere that they'd raise her children with the Garvey values. Her children were eventually separated, and remember that family land, which was purchased by their father, it was seized by the local authorities. And together, Earl and Louise instilled in their son the values of education and responsibility. As young Garveyites, Malcolm's parents were models of selflessness and sacrifice as they deferred personal freedom for the betterment of society. And I have to say now there are some books that have been written on Louise Little. There's film. I think that 50 Cent and the gentleman who's writing for Godfather of Harlem are doing on the Little family. And for example, Malcolm X and Dr. King, too often men who saw themselves as brothers, have been portrayed as polar opposites, even as enemies. People often come and they whisper to me that they were on the side of Malcolm or that they were on the side of Martin. But ladies and gentlemen, we do not have to choose sides. Both men challenged an unjust and immoral world. Even though they had their philosophical differences, my father's point of view was human rights, and Dr. King's point of view was civil rights. Both were needed to accomplish our ultimate goal. You see, Malcolm said, when we face divisiveness, which wants to convince us that we must choose one over the other, we must choose to come together. Back in my day, we were made to believe that we had to choose. Are you for Tupac or Biggie? Are you for Malcolm or Martin? Why can't we simply embrace each for his craftsmanship? Why can't we appreciate both for their undying love and commitment for their people? I've seen the beauty of community. I've witnessed sisterhood firsthand. After my father and Dr. King were assassinated, my mother and Aunt Coretta Scott King became best of friends, despite what has been portrayed as divisiveness. Years later, Dr. Bernice King and I became sister friends as well. The Shabazz Center was inspired in part by the King Center. And so we're not rivals, we're sisters. And we can choose to either fight each other or fight for each other. Because when we fight for each other, our possibilities are limitless. Our possibilities together are limitless. In these challenging times, we must become agents of hope, creating a society that works for everyone. And this means challenging systems that maintain disproportionate incarceration rates of young Black men, systems that create racial disparities and child poverty. Clinging to hope, we must propose legislation that combats injustice. There are many ways we can become agents of hope. In the 1870s, just a few years after Emancipation Proclamation, young college students attending Fisk University established Fisk Jubilee Singers. And these young students were determined to introduce the world to the great spirituals. They wrote and composed sorrow songs of their trauma. They used their angelic voices to sing crafted compositions about the terror endured on and off plantations. Their young voices echoed the refrain that Black lives matter too. Through their voice, the Jubilee Singers were able to inform, engage, and inspire a universal humanity. You see, they understood that Black power is not exclusionary. It does not divide us or elevate one person over another. It simply recognizes the crimes committed against humanity, the discrepancy in history, and it strives to restore our membership in the human family. And whether through the songs of the Jubilee Singers, the marches of the Civil Rights Movement, the sit-ins of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the actions of countless activists fighting bigotry, we too are creating hope, inspiration, solutions, and new dreams. I believe that every child deserves an opportunity to know that they are worthy of love, worthy of a quality education, and worthy to safely participate in society if they so desire. Ultimately, while we must always wrestle with the grief and despair of this social and political climate, we must also hold on to the joy that comes from generative possibility. We as a nation are more than equipped to create dynamic, radical spaces rooted in collective flourishing. This will be just a short intermission. I'm fasting. My mouth is getting dry. I'm getting hungry. You guys are looking pretty good to me. Woo! And I just want to get a little bit of energy from you. And I came from New York, and the sun sets at 7:45 in New York, but that's 8:45 here in Chicago. So I'm not sure if I was going to honor the New York time zone or the Chicago time zone, but as I understand, this young lady and I will be having a discussion after this, so I guess we'll be honoring Chicago's time. But we must also learn to engineer a new future. But to engineer a new future, we need new tools. The Nobel Prize winner Rosalind Yallo said, "New truths become evident when new tools become available." Progress in quantum computing will never be made if we're forced to rely on high school microscopes. The same applies to racial justice. Author and activist Audre Lorde said the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. So it's important to understand history so we can recognize when those distractions are there, or when the divisiveness is there. And so today's innovators must create tomorrow's change. We must manifest this change ourselves. As my father said, the future belongs to those who prepare for it today. My father was a visionary, spending much of his life fighting Jim Crow, searching for solutions to the human predicament in a nation determined to divide and conquer. Malcolm provided the biggest critique of his country, simply insisting that America live up to her promise of liberty and justice for all its citizens. In the 1950s, when young people were seeking civil rights, my father came along and said, "We demand our human rights as your brother. We demand our human rights as ordained by God," not asking. For the first time, a human rights agenda was introduced to the civil rights movement. And in less than 12 years, Malcolm showed the world how it had been miseducated about Africa as the first world nation. He internationalized the struggle for Blacks worldwide because we had no idea that we were connected as a family, as a people. Wherever Black, Indigenous people of color existed, they were experiencing the same inhumane treatment. And he sought to reimagine the national and international political landscape. In April of 1957, Minister Malcolm X exposed the world to the corruption of police forces across America. While my father was the national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam and minister at Harlem's mosque, one of its members was severely beaten, and this young man's name was Hinton Johnson. Johnson yelled out at officers as he saw them viciously beating another young man, saying, "You're not in Alabama, sir, this is New York." Well, the officers did not take kindly to Johnson's expression of free speech, so they turned their attention away from the young victim and onto Hinton Johnson. The police beat Johnson with their billy clubs so violently that he received permanent brain damage from men paid by the people to protect and serve the people. How many of you have seen Spike Lee's film, Malcolm X? Can I just see? Oh, okay. Well, you might remember in the movie, there's a scene where Malcolm organized members of his mosque to protest Johnson's murder. As a rule, each member was always responsible for 2 members. So that evening, each member called 2 members, and it became a domino effect, much like with the protests that followed the murder of George Floyd. And so 55 years ago, heeding my father's call, hundreds of young men and women rushed to Johnson's aid. In a matter of minutes, they organized outside the police station where he was being held and demanded that this young man be released from jail and be given prompt and thorough medical attention. Initially, the protesters' demands were ignored, but the protesters did not relent. They refused to leave until the appropriate medical attention for this innocent man was administered. They did not quit until they accomplished their identified goal. Their united spirit of organized activism has much to teach us today because, look, we went out marching, protesting, demonstrating, but then the march, protesting, and demonstrating was over and we went back home. And then you have to say, well, what did I accomplish? What did I accomplish? Right? So it's so important when we are organizing, demonstrating, protesting, that we know what we're marching for. What is our goal? Have we accomplished our goal? It's so important. So we have to be organized. We have to be strategic, right? And communicate amongst ourselves. We want to know, what are we marching for? What is our goal? The words of the late Congressman John Lewis ought to haunt us as we still face injustice. Amidst the civil rights struggle, John Lewis asked two questions: if not us, who? If not now, when? And so in a time where so many in our community struggle to find, I'm speeding you guys, and so in a time when so many in our community struggle to find an encouraging voice and a helping hand, we must ask, if not us, who? Because we sit and we think somebody's going to come and do something for us. We complain about the education curriculum. We complain about our communities. We make all these complaints like somebody's going to come and do something for us. We have to look in the mirror at ourselves, right? In a Senate that wants to play politics when we need a voting rights bill passed, as my father said in 1964, if not now, when? And in a country outlawing critical race theory, where students need the simple truth about history, the simple truth about everyone, rather than a few select someones in this land of milk and honey, we must ask, if not us, then who? How long is this going to continue? As inequality still stands in the way of progress and we gather to fight for justice, we must ask, if not now, then when? Dr. King's words still ring true. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But we need to add Malcolm's caveat. The arc of the moral universe won't bend on its own. It requires individual and collective effort. We must work together, pray together, walk together, and stand together. We must continuously seek to support one another and push to find our way forward together. Only together are we able to address and redress the wounds of corruption and oppression in our communities. Only together are we able to find solutions. My father said, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. The knife is still in my back. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. There's an open wound. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. And while these past years have made us aware of our collective wounds, we must do more to ensure that we are no longer victims of sexism, xenophobia, or racial profiling. We must do more to critique, dismantle, and reform the unjust, separate sets of rules under which America operates. America's truth and its history must be taught to our students in every school and at every level, not just Black students, all students. And this is part of our path forward. Textbooks that teach every child that Black history is American history, and that American history also includes Hispanic history, Native American history, and Asian history. There's no American history unless each and every voice is heard on the pages of those textbooks. And this is the beauty of our America. This is our America. To have representatives of every nation cohabiting right here together. The other day I read that a school district in Missouri voted to ban Toni Morrison's first novel, The Bluest Eye. One member who cast her vote to ban the book said, by all means buy the book for your child, but I would not want this book in our school for anyone else to see. Well, what does it say when we close our eyes and shut our ears to bigotry and injustice? What does it say about us? What does it say about our value system? A simple question I'd like you to consider is, why are people so afraid of books about history and anti-racism? Malcolm X had an answer. He said, people don't realize how a man's whole life can change by one book. Education has the power to bring about change, personal change, institutional change, systemic change. When I'm asked what changes can be made in higher education to advance social justice and the work of anti-racism, I always start with, what authors are you citing? And which books are you having your students read? Are you bringing receipts to your meetings? We must do our own research because data, both qualitative and quantitative, can bring about lasting and systemic change. People don't realize how a man's whole life can be changed by one book. Imagine if students learned in their world history class that Africa is the cradle of the most advanced civilization. Take, for example, the kingdoms of Egypt, Ethiopia, and Mali. If students were taught about Egypt and Ethiopia in the same way they've been taught about ancient Greece and Rome, we might better appreciate the beauty and magnificence of civilizations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Africa serves as both a foundation and extension of our common humanity. You see, what my father, Dr. King, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, and countless other African-American activists who sought relief from the knife wedged in their backs knew is this: even if you were not the officers who knelt on George Floyd's neck, you might very well have been one of the officers who stood by as Mr. Floyd cried out to his deceased mother and turned a blind eye. At one time or another, we've all watched, and whether out of fear or believing it not our responsibility, we've allowed injustice to perpetuate in the world around us. But I believe that education, the good, the bad, and the ugly, is the key to being woke to those very injustices. My mother, Dr. Betty Shabazz, taught me this path. She believed education is the most powerful tool to combat systemic racism. She spent the last 20 years of her life working in higher education in New York, understanding its value and ability to change lives for the better. My mother was in the system, you might say, but she knew that to overcome injustice, we have to combat it at every level. And she made sure that I received a quality education, and so I follow in her footsteps as an educator. I'd also like to hold a little light to the author Bell Hooks. She was a passionate advocate for education, self-love, and self-esteem. And Rock My Soul, she wrote, tough talking folks like to evoke Malcolm X without really studying, listening, and learning from him. If they were, they'd embrace education for critical consciousness. They'd listen to the messages he offers about the necessity of self-love and change how we see one another. How do we see one another? As a child, I remember that Sheikh Tawfiq would come to our house every Wednesday and teach us about the significant contributions that women, the continent of Africa, the diaspora, indigenous, first world nations, and Islam made to the world. We learned about the oneness of God, hence the oneness of humanity. We learned to truly love ourselves, and we did. We never relied on others to determine our self-worth. Today, it allows me to see you as a reflection of me and me as a reflection of you. To love you as much as I love myself. My parents knew if I learned to love me, I can love you. If I don't love me, I can't love you, and I will be of no help to you. When we don't learn this lesson, we get caught in a cycle of division and self-destruction. And this is likely why self-love and activism were paramount in the Shabazz household. My parents' lessons about education and activism are winding down, are more relevant than ever. My hope is that these most challenging and pressing years will produce present and future generations of problem solvers who focus on a holistic approach to human rights. For us to move the needle, this must be a transformative collective movement waged on multiple fronts, short and long term, where each of us is invested and each is an agent of change. As a nation, we have witnessed political unrest, a deep, constant grief, yet it has been a moment ripe for growth and possibility. It has propelled national discourse around the movement for Black lives, the need for systemic change and a more egalitarian America. Central to this discourse is the strength of community-led institutions that reflect our collective visions for what freedom really looks like and what accountability, democracy, and self-determination really are. Now more than ever is the time to commit to the work of radical institution building. Many progressive organizations, including the King Center and most definitely the Shabazz Center, have heeded the call for structural, systemic change, innovative institution building, and spirit-driven activism, but we need more. This is our moment right now, each and every one of us, to bring about change. We can achieve real change, justice, and love when we understand that we must act together and we must be organized and strategic. As corporate and community leaders, it is our responsibility to build and organize community networks, stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves, and make our voices heard by any means necessary. We cannot continue to be manipulated by self-centered thinking. We must reject the idea that we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. It does not work, and it never has. We must let go of divisiveness and unite around common goals to live more meaningful and purpose-driven lives. It is your turn to take the baton to higher heights. My father said unequivocally it would be this generation who would recognize that those in power have misused it and demand change. We must be united in our shared humanity and willing to do the necessary work ourselves. Our goals will be shared, our plans will be strategic, and we will be disciplined. We will strive toward greater love for one another and our community, first and foremost. And as the activist Fannie Lou Hamer said, we are in this bag together, educated and uneducated, rich and poor, women and men, we are in this bag together. When we understand that collective action matters more than individual action, we can dream new dreams. We can create a world that makes our communities resonate with the words of the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And once we learn that, we can only win together. We will stop focusing on what divides us in the midst of tragedies and triumphs and play the great jazz of life in the tone of love and in the blue note of justice, ever resisting the cacophonies of evil and hate. When we bear witness, choosing community over chaos, we will be empowered by the truth that each of us is a beautiful creation destined to shine our light for the greater good. Thank you, I love you, and may God continue to bless you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for being here with us tonight and delivering that incredibly inspiring lecture. I really enjoyed hearing it. And one thing you spoke about was how the climate we're in now isn't that different from the climate that your father, Malcolm X, was in. And so, You also spoke about the problems that we have right now with education, mass incarceration, police brutality. So if you had to identify one, what would you say is the most urgent concern facing the Black community at present?
I think it's so important for us to come together, right? We're so fragmented, we're so separated. You know, we seem to focus on things sometimes that divide us rather than what brings us together. And, you know, an example of that is having to choose. You know, we don't choose between George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. We know that they each made a contribution to our society, right? So we shouldn't choose Tupac over Biggie or, you know, Malcolm over Martin, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois. So I think it's really important to find ourselves together. We have so much power together. We're human beings. And we should have all learned that when we all found ourselves questioning our mortality with this pandemic, right? We're all human.
Thank you. And in thinking about all of us coming together in the past few years, especially as a nation, there's been a lot of turmoil, but the Black community specifically has been subject to a lot of violence and injustice. And one of the quotes from your father that you mentioned is "by any means necessary." And some people would use that to say that he was a violent person and that he encouraged others to do the same. But in your memoir, you say that that's not a violent statement. So could you expand on that and also maybe explain how you see it applying to the violence that is attributed to the current Black Lives Matter movement?
You know, when people say, oh, your father was so controversial, I'm thinking, you must not recall slavery. You must not recall human trafficking of bodies, right? That people were targeted and they were enslaved and they were held against their will in bondage. And my father was so compassionate, so loving, that he had a profound reaction to such horror and terror and trauma that he fought against it. And he believed in our collective humanity. You know, when people would meet me as a younger person, I think times have changed today, but they always had this expectation that I was going to be something other than what I was, because I was love, I was peace, I was joy. And, you know, and as I got older, I came to understand, because they had been misinformed, miseducated about my father, because he was love, peace, and joy. You have to be a person of love, of peace, of joy, of God to do the kind of work he did. And it's important for us to understand the social climate. I mean, if we understand what slavery, you know, just that whole social climate of slavery, who thinks like to do these kinds of things, or the social climate and these laws of Jim Crow, you know? So I think that we need to, this whole education, right? That we have been miseducated for far too long. And that is what drove my work. You know, I'm grateful. I grew up loving me. I love everything about me as a woman, as a person of African ancestry, as a Muslim. You know, those are three qualities on the end of the pole. I love me. No one can determine my self-worth, because my mother made sure that I learned, you know, true history, you know. And I think when children, you know, open a book, they should see a reflection of themselves. There's enough information out there, right? And they should not be subjected to any kind of curriculum that teaches anything other than that.
Thank you. And in speaking about miseducation, in your memoir, Growing Up X, you talk about, as you just mentioned, your mother, Dr. Betty Shabazz, made sure that you and your sisters, in conjunction with your private school education, knew about the importance of Black history, the importance of the African diaspora. And so could you speak a little bit more about how that, the effect that had on your development and your current career?
Yes, she is really dynamic, because she's not even looking at her paper. I'm like, you better go, girl. You better go, girl. And she's not even blushing. She's like, yes, that's right, I am. Could you ask that question again, please?
Yes. Could you speak about the effect that your mother, Dr. Betty Shabazz, making sure that you and your sisters knew Black history and knew the importance of the African diaspora at such a young age, the importance that had on your development as a person and your current career?
Yeah, well, let's see. So I was attending a girls' boarding school, prep boarding school. And there was just me and another girl we were Black, right? And we would go to a group home and we would tutor, because back then I wanted to be a mathematician until I went to college and it was like, that had nothing to do with human beings. But, and so we would tutor, and I couldn't quite understand what I was experiencing with these young people. And then when I went to college, I continued to volunteer. I went to a lockup facility and I would mentor and tutor the young girls there. And I started understanding, that everyone did not have an opportunity to love themselves, that they weren't given the tools to love themselves. And so I went into education so that I could write books and create a curriculum for young people to learn, right? And I knew that if they could identify with the subject matter, they would be more willing to learn. If you go into a church and you see all pictures of people who don't look anything like you, that's, it was challenging. And it was the same thing with, books and the history that was being shared in books. And again, if we learn about scientists, architects have, continued to uncover that humanity began in Africa, that Black Africans built these pyramids and resurrected these monuments and are the creators of astronomy and just a whole bunch of things, right? If our children could learn these things, then, certainly, I'm.
Of course. And thinking about your career, right now you're an adjunct professor. Could you talk about your choice to teach perspectives on justice in the Africana world?
That's right. First, the first question I ask my students is, perspectives on justice in the Africana world. What is that saying? That everywhere on this earth where there are Black people, they're seeking justice. Who are they seeking justice from and why? What are they being, what is the injustice they're experiencing? And so then I have to bring them through the empires, the foundation of Africa. So we see ourselves in this scholarly and spirited condition, right? The culture was universal spirit and intellect, God and scholarship. And then, journeying along and finding ourselves enslaved, rather than history beginning there, right? We have to know who we were before we got there. And then when you participate in controlling the narrative, instead of saying that they were just slaves, they were human beings held in bondage and endured the worst kind of inhumanity that one can imagine. And in spite of that, they made this significant contribution. And had it not been for them, none of us would have the opportunity today as American citizens to call this place, the land of milk and honey, our home. And so it's important to participate in the narrative and give honor to everyone and put them in proper perspective. And not sit around and think somebody else is going to do it for us, but that we have to take responsibility, those of us who know the same. Just like when seniors find the freshmen, they mentor those freshmen, and they let the freshmen understand when they become seniors, you have to reach back and mentor. So it's just extremely impossible, and that's what legacy is.
Absolutely. And speaking about mentorship and continuing to think about your career, could you share what or who has helped you the most in getting where you are today?
Well, I would say God, because, of course we find ourselves in challenging, places, but I think that we have to understand that we, as Carter G. Woodson said, wanting to control the minds of young people, recognize the power that we have, and especially the younger you recognize that, the more purposeful lives you will live, the more meaningful your life will be. My mother, God, really, I just have to give everything to God.
Absolutely. And could you share any advice that you have for young people who are interested in doing more work in social justice and activism?
Yeah, I think it's just important to first, know yourself, know your value system, know that you're worthy of just everything, that we're beautiful, just as God created us, right? And anyone who wants to put that light out, they don't really deserve to be in your space unless you can encourage them to be better. But that there's just so much more in life that you can have when you understand the power that you possess and your legacy. What will that be? What will that look like?
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I think that's going to conclude this portion of our program. So if we could please give a round of applause for our speaker again. Thank you. And now we're going to move to our audience Q&A portion. So as a reminder, you can scan the barcode there and submit your questions online. And after we get through those questions, we'll see if there's any questions in the audience as well. So reading our questions is going to be the co-president of OBS, Etsy Kumsen.
Thank you so much. As Jordan said, I would like to echo everything Jordan said. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, your knowledge. I have personally benefited, and I'm sure everyone else here also appreciated you spending your time with us. And so I would like to encourage all of us to give Ms. Ilyasah Shabazz one more round of applause.
And we might as well keep it going for these two young ladies.
So one question that we have here, you touched on this in the sense of finding your purpose, finding what it is that gets you going, something that you're passionate about. And so someone was wondering, what advice would you give to young Black women who are struggling to find their footing or recognize their purpose in today's society? And do you have any book recommendations for emerging Black leaders of today?
Oh my gosh, I do. I have so many books. What I can say is that you can always email me. You go to my website, ilyasahshabazz.com, or growingupx.com. I think it's just really important to love who we are. That's the first and foremost. I'm so grateful that my mother, I'm so grateful for what she, the model that she provided for her girls. I remember in our living room was this statue of a woman, and I think it was from Haiti. And it was about 7 feet tall. And we were like me as a little girl, 7 feet tall, and the woman is holding a child in one hand and a basket on top of her head, and she's in stride. And that just said so much to me that, there's nothing that we can't do. We're multitasking. My father said a society is measured by the progress of its women. When you teach a woman, you raise it. When you teach a man, you teach a community. But when you teach a woman, you raise a nation, right? So how can we not understand, who we are, right? Yeah, but so many books, so many books.
Thank you for that. Another question we had was, what do you think our responsibility is as a Black community to support and engage in Black placemaking?
I think it is to control the narrative of our stories, right? Civilization began with Black people, right? And so we have to control the narrative of our stories, participate in the narratives. I say the same thing to Muslims. I say the same thing to anyone who is complaining, non-binary, who are complaining about injustice of any kind. Control the narrative, tell the story. And it's our duty.
Thank you. And in line with that, someone also was wondering, do you feel an obligation as Malcolm X's daughter to pick up the mantle of his vision and to carry on his legacy? Because you spoke highly of him and your mother throughout your lecture. And so in what ways do you feel the need to carry on his legacy?
I don't think I have this need to carry on the legacy or I think that because the information about him was absolutely inaccurate, I felt like I had to avenge my father, that he was a man of compassion, he was kind, he was loving, and this image that was created by Hoover for such a long time was so inaccurate. And so I felt like I needed to not only appropriate that, but also provide information for young generations of people who didn't know who they were, right? Who had been misinformed.
And then one final question before I open it up to people in the audience. How have you navigated your faith in Islam through social justice? And how do you reflect on being Muslim now because of your experiences?
I'm Muslim. I was born Muslim. Everything about how I developed into a woman and a human being is from an Islamic perspective. Just as I am a woman, just as I am a person of the African diaspora.
Thank you so much for all those amazing answers. Does anyone here in our audience have a question for Ms. Shabazz? If you can introduce yourself really quickly.
Hi, I'm Bianca, a third year and the co-president of the African and Caribbean Students Association on campus. So I guess one question I have for you, as a student in the American context, what advice do you have for students that really want to know more about Africa and get to know that perspective that's outside of a history of slavery? So.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, in Africa, it's not about a history of slavery, right? It's about birthing, civilization. Sheikh Anta Diop, he does a really great a documentary that's online that you can see so many episodes. And he starts from the beginning, of the beginning of man, the creation of man, African thought. Right? And it is really just the most enlightening, one of the most enlightening documentaries that I've seen, Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop. Thank you for your question.
Hi, my name is Jandrick. I'm a fourth year here at the college. So my question is, how should we as freedom fighters, I guess, put into context the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the context of abolition? You as a Muslim and many others, it's often framed as a clash between two sort of civilizations. So yeah.
That's everywhere. It's so unfortunate that, I'm beginning to think that it is a human problem. It's a human problem. And I would love to hear what you have to say. What do you think would be one way of resolving that?
I think it has to do with how we frame the war. I think it's often understood as the war itself among Arabs, Palestinians, they kind of look at it as a huge disaster, whereas Israeli look at it as their independence, so pivotal to their identity. But I think if it was framed sort of differently as a war, almost as a civil war was here in the US, to where people kind of come together to develop one nation. Yeah, I don't know. It's definitely something to think about, but I think it's really the context of how you frame the fighting and the coming together afterwards.
And how you identify Palestinian, Arab, Israeli. It's all. Oh.
Hello, I'm Samantha Taylor. I'm a first year representative for the Organization of Black Students. And my question would be that I think all of us here are interested in social impact. And I think when we look at a lot of our goals, it's to end things like racism, to end things that have anything to do with social injustice. But looking at it from like where you are now to where you want to go, it's a large jump. So what would be your advice on kind of like, I don't want to call it incremental change, but kind of keeping hope in like the baby steps and the small steps when a lot of the things we want to see is an accumulation of centuries and centuries of disenfranchisement? And then how do you not lose yourself in that purpose? How do you make sure that you keep your own cup full before giving to others, but make sure that you still kind of keep on with that path?
Well, you know, like my mother, she was in the system. She was in education. And so I think that we have to inform ourselves. We have to be very educated and be a part of that system and work it from the inside out.
Hello,
I'd like to hear what you had to say too. Can I just hear what would be some of her suggestions? I would love to hear that. But I bet you do. You don't? Yes.
so I think it's on me now, but my name is,
I would really like to.
oh yeah.
I don't know. I feel like change is a big question. I think for me, like a lot of people kind of, there's different perspectives across the spectrum. There's people who think that you need to like take everything up and go from there, but I think that's a bit overwhelming, especially when you get into this work before you have any sort of power when it comes to like voting or laws. And so I believe in looking directly. I think the larger you go, the harder it is to create the change from macro level. And so I think it starts with those interpersonal relationships. It starts with, like you said, the way that you treat yourself and the way that you treat others. And anywhere you go, you can look in your community, you can look in your area, and you can find things that you are not okay with. And so if you're not willing to start there, then you can't really go any bigger. But also it's holding yourself to a certain standard. You can't expect people to do things and live a life that you aren't doing for yourself. And so if you can be it and you can live it and you can share that mentality with other people, then we all hold ourselves accountable. We all rise to this level of what we want to see.
Go. Okay. So my name is Deontay. I'm right here. I'll stand up. And I'm from Chicago. I was born and raised here. I grew up in the Trumbull Park homes. And so I found it interesting that you highlighted specifically this concept of loving yourself. And so coming from the community in which I come from, I believe that we struggle with that deeply, right? And I think it's a profound thought, and I would love for you to expound more on how someone comes about loving themselves or teaching someone else to love themselves more.
We can't accomplish anything individually, right? Imagine all of this, imagine if we all came together and we listed what we wanted to accomplish. We could accomplish them much more quicker. We could accomplish them more together than we could as individuals. But we're not going to come together because the image of who we are is so tainted. And so it's re-educating ourselves, right? So my mother made sure that I loved who I was by making sure that I learned about history in its true sense. Every Wednesday, as I mentioned, Sheikh Tawfiq would come to our house and he would teach us about Africa. He would teach us about Islam. And it was all truthful. And in retrospect, I realized that I learned these things so that I could love me. If I did not love who I was, I would not be here. If I did not love who I was, I would not do the work that I do. If I didn't love who I was, I would not have committed myself to the things that I do. And so I see myself as a reflection of you truly. It's very easy for me to say, I love you, right? Because I love myself. But if I did not love me, I wouldn't even, I wouldn't have any time to be near you, especially with all of the images that are, you know, and all the false information that it says Black is, right? There's so many things in our culture that divides us. Imagine if we participated in the curriculum that brought us all together. It almost seems like it could never happen, but it can, because some people thought slavery would never end, but it did. So there's so many things that we could accomplish if we understood that some, you know, we know we're being programmed to think certain ways, make certain choices. But if we were programmed, you know, in truth.
For that. Thank you so much for that great answer. Sorry if you all had more questions, you can email Ms. Shabazz, as she said, on her website. You'll find her email. And so if you have further questions, you can do so. Fortunately, we have to end. And so I would hand it over to Jordan to close us out.
And I would like to introduce Syra Gale, first-year representative for OBS, to give our closing remarks.
Good evening again, everyone. I would like to take the time to give a few thanks to those who facilitated the happening and success of this event. Firstly, to Ms. Shabazz, thank you for your time and for allowing us all the privilege to hear the wisdom that you have shared with us tonight. The Organization of Black Students is extremely grateful to have been given the opportunity to add you to the list of distinguished Black scholars that have spoken at our Kent lecture. I would also like to thank the Harris School of Public Policy for their support in this collaboration. Last but not least, I would like to thank the audience, both in person and virtually, for joining us tonight. The entirety of this event could not have come to fruition without all of you, so thank you once again. If this lecture has left you hungry for more food, that is, there will be refreshments and hors d'oeuvres after the event in Color Cafe. Have a great rest of the evening. Thank you.